Hello, guten Tag und grüß Gott. Today is May the 11th, 2025, and it's a Sunday. Love to do these things on Sundays. In any case, the news of over the last couple of weeks is probably dominated by the fact that Pope Francis died, and we now have a new pope. And the pope was elected like on a second ballot or so, or on the second day. I'm not entirely sure, but it was rather quickly, because sometimes these things, these conclaves, they go on for days and maybe weeks, of debating and talking and deliberating. But let me show you. Here is the picture of the new pope. And here you can see him. Now, what's interesting is that this pope, his last name is Prevost. So that's a kind of a strong family name. In fact, there's a Prevost corporation that makes motorhomes. The Prevost motorhome is very famous. And I'm not sure that there's any relation there. But in any case, what's really fascinating about this, that not only is the new pope an American, but he's from Chicago. Oh my God, and he's 69 years old. So anyway, so he was born, 1956 or something like that. You can do the math. It also means, that I lived in Chicago between 1962 and 69. So, there could have been a chance encounter, Anyway, interesting that as a cardinal, as a matter of fact, he's been close to us here, off and on, because he was actually, I think, a bishop in San Bernardino, which is here in California. And then I think most recently, somewhere in South America, he was cardinal. And then, no, most recently he was cardinal here in the United States. But he spent a lot of time in South America. The guy is evidently a polymath, speaks several languages. And of course, these guys have to speak several languages to begin with, because, I think it's a requirement, for a cardinal to be able to speak Italian, speak Latin, and French. I don't think there was a requirement to speak English, but he speaks English, of course. He grew up in Chicago, went to Villanova University. Anyway, and the reason I know about Villanova, because Bradley, where I went, we used to play Villanova, when we were good enough, because these guys were really, the Catholic school, they had a really great basketball team all the time. And you see them in the news now and then anyway. So, yeah. So we have a new pope, and, that's just about all I can talk about, about the new pope. I'm kind of excited to, maybe not enough. I'm kind of excited to see a new pope, because I think Pope Francis was... from my sensibilities, far too liberal. And he was, as a matter of fact, and he tried to change the church. So I'm not a Catholic, although, I spent some formative years of mine, in a Catholic family. As a matter of fact, Michael and Lisa grew up as Catholics. And... So maybe I just want to leave it at that. But the thing is that I do respect the Catholic Church. It's been around for around 1,000 years or so, and maybe even longer. Maybe not as a Catholic Church as such, but they basically formed the what is Christianity today. And of course Luther, kind of changed things a bit, because the Reformation was probably an essential thing for Catholicism or Christianity in general. But yeah, I'm not so sure that that Luther had this right. Salvation through faith alone, and he translated the Bible into from Latin into German, and so then other people followed right with that. So it just kind of makes sense that somebody came around and made the word of God, so to speak, more accessible to common people that didn't speak Latin, had their own language. And so it just seemed like it was the right thing, is that to do at the time, in the 1500s there, when Luther actually created the German language, one could argue, because the High German was actually, it's the biblical German. And, as a German, the German Bible was really easy to understand because it seemed more close, more imminent than, let's say, the King James version, because it had a lot of antique words in it and so on. And the Lutheran Bible was more of like, maybe the New Catholic version, where it's a little more accessible. Anyway, one could argue that accessibility is not necessarily a good thing, and I'm going to make that argument because, why was the Bible in Latin to begin with? Okay, it was in Latin because nobody wanted to change it. I mean, it remained, after after it developed from the Septuagint, and the Hebrew Bible, and in the Greek and so on, and then there's this whole history, of how a bunch of rabbis got together, even, basically rewrote the Torah, Anyway, I think I'm diverging a little bit, here, but what I really wanted to say is that, maybe the word shouldn't be quite that accessible, because if it is, then it's in a way like, pearls before the swine, and that sounds like a really terrible thing to say, but if you become so familiar with it that you hear it in your own language constantly, do you ever really stop and think about it? But imagine, if the Mass is recited in Latin and you don't understand it, and you go to your priest and you say, hey, what is it that you say in this part here? And he explains it to you, what it says and what it means, and then now you can talk about it. So in other words, when the Bible was in Latin only, it attracted those curious, the ones that wanted to find out something, the ones that wanted to know more. And once you make the word, ubiquitous and available, it may not mean as much to a lot of people. But that's just pure opinion and conjecture, So everything probably happened for the right reason anyway. So here we are. And you know what? It's not just that we've elected a pope. For this particular video, it's got to do something with May 11th, Muttertag. Okay, and you say, what is Muttertag? Muttertag is Mother's Day. And, we always, do something nice for our mom. There are the flowers, and this time it was Krispy Kreme donuts for breakfast, And we're actually going out for dinner again, and there's small gifts and so on. Anyway, Mother's Day. So, unfortunately, Marge right now, our homebound mother, is suffering from knee surgery, and I think I may have mentioned that before, and if I didn't, then it needs to be mentioned. Is that she had a knee replacement back in August of 24, and just recently that knee replacement failed. And what failed was that somewhere in there, hiding out, was an infection. And it eventually caused a huge problem. And so they had to open everything up again, clean it all up, and she's now still on antibiotics to make sure that they've conquered that infection in the knee. And we're very positive because she's under really good care. But I tell you what, it's a big pain in the butt. She's taken every day. She's taken a whole series of shots directly intravenously. 2 big ampules of antibiotics and a bunch of saline solution, and I don't know what else they've put in there. But that's been going on now for about 3 weeks, and it's still going to happen till about the 15th or so. So probably at least for another week. Anyway, so we're doing the best we can here. Everybody's pitching in, and we expect Mom to get well and fully recover, and that ultimately the new knee will work just fine. So anyway, so I'd like to talk about my mother a little bit because, I've mentioned my mom over the series of videos here and there because, she's kind of a hero in a way because she made sure that we survived, that the family survived in some really, really tough times, the post-war era. And she's really, really a smart woman. So I want to mention some of the attributes again, which I have mentioned once before. But I kind of hate to call her a fortune teller, but she was able to read cards, and in today's vernacular, in in common knowledge, this is called cold reading, and it's not highly thought of. But I tell you what, it's really interesting is that she somehow knew a lot. And the reason I can say that is because the things that she was telling people often came true. And she was right in a lot of ways. And as a matter of fact, while we were in touring and, on our way from the east to the west, that's how she supported us, and that's she, people would give her food, would give her bread and so forth. So, I've often wondered, just how in the world did she learn that? And maybe I asked her and she told me and I didn't know, I didn't remember it, and I don't remember it now. But let me tell you, what I do know is that she told me a story that she used to hang around with gypsies, okay? And, hang around, meaning the kids, when the gypsies came to town, they usually set up some sort of a camp at the edge of town. And, they were campers, happy campers. They came with their horse-drawn carriages, which were campers. And they would, have fire, and then you would smell the cooking. I used to go there too, when the gypsies came to Marbach, and, we used to go. But unfortunately, the gypsies weren't really highly thought of because, I remember in Marbach, the people, when the gypsies came, everybody, heard about it right away. Oh, there are gypsies at the edge of town and stuff like this, so people, started to lock up their doors and so on, because sometimes they would come around, and maybe take something here and there. But it wasn't always that way, because what they would do is you could go and get your fortune told. That was one of the things, and people used to visit them because they always had somebody's, that would, use the cards for cold reading or that kind of a thing. And, before you poo-poo that, those methods, let's give it some credit that it's it's thousands of years old, you know. I mean, the casting of runes, you know, reading of the entrails, you know, and so forth, you know, to divine the future. That's been around for a long time. And of course, the tarot cards, you know. Now, my mom never used tarot cards, although she understood the tarot cards too. So let's get back to the gypsies. She told me a story, you know, that the gypsies got mad at her one time because she used to visit often, because she happened to trip and her foot stepped into what they were cooking, and what they were cooking was pudding, and of course they got all upset over that, you know, and so forth. And my mom was just a little girl at the time, but now I'm wondering is whether she, with that hanging around the gypsies, is how she picked up, fortune telling over the cards. And it wasn't, you know, you couldn't. The reason I hate that fortune telling, you know, is because in German, Wahrsagen is called truth telling, which is also not quite right, because how do you know the future as truth, you know? So it's kind of a strange thing. But she always had something going, because she knew a lot. She had a lot of feelings, you know, of things. You know, for instance, she says, "Oh, my mom died today." Now, her mom, you know, was taken away by the Poles and the Russians, along with her husband, and put in a camp. And they and we never heard from her again. I think I made a video on that, but tragically, you know, she just kind of disappeared. And how in the world, you know, a person can just disappear like that, you know, no records whatsoever, is just amazing. But I guess, well, in this case it happened, and I guess it can happen. So, and anyway, so much about my grandmother, or her mother. But anyway, she, when she married my dad, my mom, when she married my dad, she says, you know, I don't know how to cook, okay? And my dad said, well, don't worry, you know, we'll always have somebody cook for us. And they sure did, because they hired somebody, you know, that was helping mom, you know, take care of me. And, you know, then, you know, Heinz was born, take care of Heinz, you know, and then Walter was born, you know. So, you know, mom, she told me, she said, I'd like to have as many kids as I possibly can. And I believe that, you know, because she got started with having kids, you know, right away, you know, with marriage, because I think there was at least one child that was born before me, you know, and I think was born before me, but then died shortly. So it was a live birth, you know, but he just didn't make it. And then I was born, and I made it, and I'm still here. Anyway, oh yeah. So mom wanted to have lots of kids, and she did manage to have at least the 5 of us, you know, which is pretty good. And now, you know, we're starting to fade away. Lost my brother. We lost our brother back in 2012, I believe. 2011, 2012, somewhere in that 2010 maybe. Now I can't remember exactly when, but it was quite a while ago. Agent Orange got him. And another brother of ours is, we haven't heard from him in a while, so we don't really know what's going on with him. He's kind of a private guy himself, you know. He doesn't really talk to us very much. And then the youngest one, John, of course, he's around. He's on the East Coast. And then my sister, Heidi. So there are potentially 4 of us still around. Anyway. going back to cooking, I'm going all over the place with this because, this totally stream of consciousness, there's nothing written. My mom really did learn to cook. I loved her cooking. And she always told me that I was her best eater because I ate everything that she cooked, and I ate not just everything, but all of it, So, so there was that, and I really do I loved her cooking a lot, and so she used to cook for us. But I remember how where we had an apartment, she used to look out the window in the evening to see whether she could see my dad coming from the train station from work. And then when she saw him, she would rush, to put the dinner table together. Everybody had their place. Now, when we sat down for dinner, we didn't have, the meat in the middle and the potatoes and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, we did have all that, but it was not for us to reach for it. She would go around to everybody's plate and give them what she thought that we would eat. Okay? Everybody got a portion in accordance to what she thought that would eat so that there would be no leftovers, period, So my dad would sit on one end of the table, she would sit on the other end of the table. And but before then, she would go around and, with meat and with this. And you could ask, hey, can I have a little more or something like this? And if she felt like it, she'd give it to you. If she had it, she'd give it to you. Now, you also have to remember that I'm talking about a time right after the war where food was scarce, okay? We had food stamps, for instance, meat, the weekly allowance for meat, I think, was like 100 grams, of meat per person. So there wasn't much food around, And then, yeah, you could have the stamps, but, they didn't necessarily have the meat, So it was, so we lived mostly on vegetables, milk, cheese, sauerkraut. Oh, God, do we have sauerkraut? And fish. We ate a lot of fish. Anyway, yeah, so Mom, she somehow learned how to cook. And she knew how to cook. And and she was a great cook. As a matter of fact, when we came to the States, my dad wouldn't eat out because he didn't like the food, anywhere else. Finally. I remember in Peoria, he found a place where he could eat out, and that was a Chinese place, and it was up in an attic, of a building. And that's when we learned to enjoy what they call chop suey, whatever that was at the time. It's some sort of Chinese food. Anyway, but he wouldn't, McDonald's hamburger or anything like that. That wasn't his fare whatsoever. He just wouldn't eat that. So Mom always had to cook, and that went on, for almost her entire life until she had a stroke, a really bad stroke, and she didn't know how to cook anymore, so Dad had to start taking over the cooking. In any case, Mom, if you're listening to this, I want to apologize because I didn't always treat you the best, and I wish I treated you better. And I remember, you always saying, "Oh, don't say that, because someday you will look for me with a lantern." And I miss you, Mom. Anyway. Oh, maybe just one little anecdote. This would have been a good time to finish, but I just want to tell you that my mom was actually a really good-looking woman. She had great legs. okay, because she entered a competition, for they were looking for people with a certain kind of leg size, and she had my dad measure her legs, and they turned it in, and sure enough, it was the right leg size, but somebody else won that competition anyway, maybe by a millimeter, who knows? But so I remember that my aunt, Tante Lotte, her sister, married a guy from Russia. Now he was a Volga German, but interesting. His name was actually Nahirny. Nahirny sounds a little bit Russian to me. But anyway, he could speak perfect German and evidently perfect Russian, and this wasn't unusual. The Germans that lived in other countries, they knew the language, the local language, and they maintained their Germans pretty much like the Jews. They had their Yiddish, and they probably knew the local languages, the customary language as well. So everybody just kind of maintained their own cultures. So the Germans, in Poland where we lived, and they spoke German and Polish. And the Germans in Russia, we called them Volga Germans. They spoke Russian and German. Anyway, this guy had a bunch of friends, and my dad, actually befriended some of these people, that hung around my aunt's husband. Anyway. So so one day, I remember hearing that, this is, you need to look that up on the internet, this Russian guttural singing, it's a real deep voice, and it's very melodic, and it's really interesting, but it's really deep. And, one of the popular songs is called the Volga Boatman. That kind of, if you look that up, that kind of gives you an idea of what that was. Anyway, so these guys got shit-faced, or drunk, and they came and they serenaded my mom, and they asked for her to come on the window. Now, it was in the middle of the night, okay, like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, whatever. I do remember the sound, of that, and my mom, yelling at him. That was funny, It's she didn't appreciate it because you wake up the neighbors, that kind of stuff, But obviously, these Volga Germans, they appreciated the beauty of my mom, So that's about it, It was Mother's Day, and those Volga Germans, they serenaded my mom. All right, I guess this is long enough, With that, I bid you farewell. So, auf Wiedersehen, and so long.